pathway. I'll start that again. We were recording. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another behavioral support rounds. Today's session focuses on a transitional pathway and tools, specifically my transitional care plan during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Stacey Guy, and I am a knowledge broker with the Ontario Centres for Learning, Research and Innovation in Long-Term Care. Agnes, if we could have the next slide. Although we are meeting virtually, it is important to pause and acknowledge that Baycrest and our related Toronto Central Local Health Integration Network behaviour support programs operate on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples. And we recognize the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Rounds is supported in part with funding from the Government of Ontario through the Ontario Centre for Learning, Research and Innovation in Long-Term Care, the Behaviour Supports for Seniors program, and the Toronto Central Local Health Integration Network. Next slide, please. Before we start, I would like to review some participation guidelines. Please keep your microphone muted while the speakers are presenting. This session is being recorded and will be archived on the Ontario CLRI and BSO websites. We will have 40 minutes of presentation, followed by approximately 15 minutes of discussion and a wrap up. Please place any questions you have in the chat. We'll be monitoring throughout the presentation. If you have questions related to any tech support needs, please message Agnes. She comes up as telehealth in your participant list. For those of you interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, please enter your name and email address in the completed evaluation form. We will be sending a link in the chat later. Next slide, please. We have a number of presenters joining us today, representing a number of organizations, including Behavioral Supports Ontario, Brain Exchange, and Baycrest Health Sciences. Welcome Simone, Einat, Lindsay, Gillian, and Caitlin. It's over to you.
Wonderful, thank you so much, and
thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Gillian, I'm just gonna do a little introduction to the topic, and I'm gonna share our slides. And Caitlin. Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. I just wanted to say that we're talking about transitions, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here. Transitions have always been a hot topic, so to speak, I would say, for our system, and certainly a priority area for behavior support, because we know that most of our clients with responsive behaviors are highly impacted by the actual transition itself. And we may also see an escalation. We often see an escalation in responsive behaviors as a result of the transition itself. And we also know that setting our clients, families, and the teams for success in transition really requires a lot of collaboration, coordination, and information sharing. So especially at a time like this, where we are seeing so much movement in the system from acute care to long-term care or other subacute locations, we're very happy to have us all come together to address this topic and show some innovative work that has been developed through behavior support to address these transitions provincially and also locally. And so we look forward to having a discussion with you, a fulsome discussion with you at the end. And I would like to first hand the stage to our provincial partners, Caitlin and Gillian. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Einat. If we can move to the next slide. It's really such a pleasure to be collaborating on today's presentation. And on this slide here, you'll see our agenda for the next 35 to 40 minutes. We're going to be starting with a background on the development of my transitional care plan during the COVID-19 pandemic tool. We'll then be walking through the tool in action in the Toronto Central region through a broader transitional pathway. Next, we'll discuss the role of long-term care in-house transitions teams to support the pathway, and we'll wrap things up with a case study followed by a Q&A. As Stacey said, throughout the presentation, we invite everyone to put comments and questions in the chat pod, and we'll do our best to get to them. Next slide, please. So the development of my transitional care plan during the COVID-19 pandemic began in the early days of the pandemic, when it was identified that our Behavioural Supports Ontario teams were receiving an increasing number of referrals to support transitions across a variety of sectors. This growing demand for transitional support was something that was brought up at our Behavioural Supports Integrated Teams, or BSIT, collaborative. The BSIT collaborative is essentially a province-wide working group that meets monthly to develop products related to the experience of transitions for the BSO population. Our most recent product, prior to the one that we'll be presenting today, was a checklist of critical elements to support transitions into long-term care. A screenshot of that document is on this slide, and hopefully it looks familiar to many of you. So equipped with this document and getting a lay of the land of the context of the pandemic, the BSIT collaborative felt very confident that we could create a product to support moves across different sectors throughout the pandemic. On the next slide, you'll see that luckily we didn't have to start from scratch. We decided to adapt my transitional care plan, a tool that was created and used by BSO and partnering teams here in Northeastern Ontario. The decision to adapt something that was already existing and already used quite widely in one of the areas of Ontario meant that we could create something specific to the pandemic a lot more quickly. And it also meant that we felt confident that we were creating something that we knew could be implemented within the context of the Ontario healthcare system. So the purpose of the original My Transitional Care Plan is to provide a summary to assist those that are in the circle of care at understanding unique details about a person who is moving to a new place. The creation of the original My Transitional Care Plan was led by Kylie Turcott, a transitions nurse with our Behavioural Supports Ontario Seniors Mental Health Regional Consultation Service here at the North Bay Regional Health Centre. So on the next slide, you'll see that after making that decision to adapt my transitional care plan for a version specific to the pandemic, we quickly got to work. Over the next couple of Behavioural Supports Integrated Teams collaborative meetings, we reviewed each section of the original tool, and we made a decision about which items could remain the same, which ones would need to be adapted to fit the pandemic, and what new sections would need to be added that would specifically speak to the context of moving from one place to another during various stages of the pandemic. We really wanted to avoid reinventing the wheel, so we also hyperlinked other relevant documents that were being created at the same time, things like Personhood tools, as well as the Dementia Isolation Toolkit, which hopefully all of you are very familiar with. So following this process of adapting the tool itself, we also created guidelines to support its use. And then we also provided a completed example of the tool as a teaching and learning resource. Fast forward to September of 2020, the BSIT collaborative decided that the best way to test out my transitional care plan during the COVID-19 pandemic would be to simply release it as a trial version. So we did just that in October, and we collected feedback on its use, what was missing, what was going well throughout the time period of October to January. And on the next slide, you'll see that after collecting that feedback, we made some changes, and then we released version 2.0 in April of 2021, alongside some updated guidelines, the updated completed example, and we also had the opportunity to translate the tool as well as all the supporting resources in French as well. Shortly after, we saw the change in Directive number 3, which has significantly impacted isolation requirements. So we released version 2.1 just a couple of short weeks ago, and this is the version that is available for download on the brainexchange.ca/BSOBSID website. And now I'll turn things over to Jillian, who's going to provide us with a tour of the tool.
Thanks, Caitlin. So a couple of notes to just mention before we begin the tour. First off, it's important to note that it's not necessary to fill out every section of the tool in order for it to be useful. We note that sometimes information asked for in the plan might already be available elsewhere. So it may be simply easier to attach that information, for instance, like a medication list, to this COVID-19 or my transitional care plan during COVID-19 tool versus then having to fill it out completely all brand new. Also, I want to note that in the beginning of the first page, you'll notice just like the other BSO tools that we have, this tool is written in first-person language, and we feel that that's really important to highlight, and we're very proud of that fact as well. And then finally, the first section of the tool, this part that you see in front of you, it's pretty intuitive. However, one thing to note is the importance of identifying a transitional support lead. That is someone who's going to take the lead in facilitating the move and someone who's going to serve as the key contact for the transition. So in this whole section, you'll see it has a lot of demographic information included and really focuses on the where the resident is currently living and where their destination will be and the approximate time that is supposed to take place, along with, as I mentioned before, additional supports in helping that person have a successful transition. Next slide. So in this section, we focus on, and this is, I should mention, we've broken this down just for visual ease, so you can have a quick glance at each section in a more zoomed in fashion. But obviously, as Caitlin demonstrated in earlier slides, this is all sort of on a number of pages total. So in this section here, we talk about a transportation plan and an arrival plan. And of course, we note that arrival plans can be changing on an ongoing basis. So we really tried to keep this at high level. And we do mention here that the substitute decision maker is able to enter the home, yes or no. And of course, that differs depending on regions and restrictions and whether screening protocols have been reviewed. And then we also talk about their personhood summary and their typical daily routine. So again, noting that if that tool's already been completed, just to indicate it in that box so that we can look for it and attach it, but you don't have to repeat yourselves in this box. And of course, we talk about daily routines, what are wake up time preferences, sleep time preferences, eating preferences as an example, but also to draw your attention to that lower right-hand corner where we talk about my smoking, alcohol, or other substance use plans. We just want to make sure that we've accommodated those strategies that might be in place for this particular individual. Next slide. So now we move on to room setup. So again, recognizing that this may differ depending on where you're located and the different restrictions that are currently in place. We do provide an opportunity to state whether a room setup can be done in advance on the day of the move, or if they're not able to bring their personal items into the home for a variety of reasons. We also make space to identify who will set up that room, whether it might be a care partner or whether staff might be able to assist in that, and what are some of the key or favorite items that might make the room feel a little bit more home-like. In the red boxes, this is really specific to COVID-19. So we have the My Isolation Care Plan Strategy Summary, and Caitlin already alluded to this already. So again, making room for that box to say, yes, a plan has been made and it is attached. And then we also make space for some specifics and when the delivery of that plan is meant to take place. And then we look at COVID-19 PPE and swabbing support strategies, focusing on what PPEs have been successful, and also what swabbing strategies have been successful. For instance, reducing background noise or providing blankets, companion pets, etc. Next slide. We also addressed some response behaviors and personal expressions, and we wanted to make sure that there was a significant amount of room for this. This section is modeled after the behavioral strategies, rather behavioral categories in the BSO DOS, with specific COVID-19 risk and strategies that are located on your right side of this form. So there's room to address vocal expressions, motor expressions, sexual expressions of risk, verbal expressions of risk, and physical expressions of risk. But then we also want to look specifically, as I mentioned, at those COVID-19 risks and strategies as well. And then again, on the lower right, any other identified risks that should be mentioned and are relevant to the person's successful transition, be it fall risk, suicidal ideation, or some other. Next slide. So going back to our earlier discussions about our transitions nurse, Kylie, and her experience with the development of the original plan, she shared with us that these two prompts often contained critical information for helping moves go a lot smoother. So we wanted to make sure that we had space for causes of distress or discomfort, as well as validation strategies. And this is certainly one of those sections where information from family care partners is instrumental. So we actually, if you look in total, this takes up a fair bit of real estate on those forms, and that's very intentional because we really want that to be included and for family members to have opportunity to provide information in these. So then moving on, we talk about assistive devices. And, different prompts that people might need help with or reminders for different types of tasks. So there's lots of check marks here that people can go through in a relatively quick manner. And this is one of those areas where, again, the information might already be available elsewhere. So this might not be necessary to complete in full, but we still wanted to provide the opportunity there in case this was the very first time these sorts of acknowledgements were taking place. And then we move on to family connections and social supports. And again, we recognize that this may vary depending on different changing policies within long-term care and within the provincial and regional restrictions that seem to be moving rapidly. So again, wanted to keep it fairly high level. We make room to include virtual visits, phone calls, in-person visits, window visits, and maybe something else we haven't categorized here, noting that whether indoor or in-person visits can be indoors and or outdoors. And then we also, on your right-hand side of the screen, talk about time frame, whether any of these visits can take place during isolation or post-isolation. So again, high level, trying to leave lots of room in case things change. And then finally, this latter part of the tool really focuses on just any of the existing information that's out there that's already been done, like we suggest a BSO assessment, a seniors or geriatric mental health assessment, a med list, a vaccine list, etc. If those reports are done already, this is where you can also note that they've been completed and that they've been attached to the document. We also want to make space for if there's any clinicians or teams that might be available to help the individual and support their successful transition, to list them here. And that may be the key change in helping this individual transition successfully. And of course, the latter part, again, who it's completed by, a contact number and an organization and signature and date. And there's a little blurb on the very bottom here. Hopefully you can see it, but if not, I'm going to read it out to you. And it says, this transitional care plan was developed based on the individual's presentation in their environment at the time of transition. This plan may require adaptation in the new environment, as differing behaviors may present themselves throughout the transition period. I know I'm speaking to the choir on this, but we really felt it was necessary and important to still make note of that within the tool, just to emphasize that it's not static and it can change at any point, and to reflect those changes if need be. So Caitlin, I'm going to turn that back over to you.
Perfect, thank you, Jillian. So since releasing the trial version of my transitional care plan during the COVID-19 pandemic back in October, we heard from teams across and beyond Ontario who've shared their strategies to support the implementation. So we thought that we would share a few facilitators to implementing the tool with all of you today. Certainly, the primary barrier identified by all teams is time, both in the sense of transitions needing to take place very quickly, as well as time to actually complete the tool and to read the tool for those that are receiving a new resident or patient in their home. So here are some of those potential strategies. First, getting buy-in from both teams at both ends of the transition, and really ultimately knowing that the time that it takes to put together the document is going to save so much time in the long run. This can be achieved by sharing the supporting resources for the tool, as well as videos such as today's to help get teams on board. Consider committing to using my transitional care plan during the COVID-19 pandemic once or twice to get experience with it, and getting buy-in from management and leadership is also essential so that team members are provided the time to complete and review the tool. Second, collaboration, for example, with the long-term care team, hospital discharge planners, and home and community care support services. There's really such a need to get numerous team members on board with filling out the information and sharing the most relevant aspects to this person and their care. Third is the involvement of family care partners, as Jillian mentioned, especially for those sections that pertain to personhood. Fourth, starting to fill it out as soon as possible. So for example, at the time of long-term care application from retirement home, from private dwelling, or from hospital, or even when it's starting to be suspected that somebody may need to move to a different place soon. And lastly, consider creating a transitional care pathway that incorporates the tool within a larger process. And to learn more about this strategy, I'll invite Lindsay to take things from here.
Thank you, Caitlin. So here within Toronto Central, in an effort to build capacity and address the strategies for implementing the My Transitional Care Plan during C19, our TC Lynn Transitions Working Group did just that and got down to work. Our team used the provincial BSIT Transitional Guiding Checklist, which Caitlin mentioned at the onset of the presentation, as a best practice guideline. And in alignment with this provincial tool, we have created 2 simplified pathways for clinicians and multi-sector care teams' quick reference. The first is a pathway focusing on the use of the My Transitional Care Plan during COVID-19 and the triggering of a Personhood Tool meant to accompany it. This first pathway is a 4-step process offering best practice guidelines for collaboration, transition planning, handover, and implementation. The second pathway we have created delves a little deeper by introducing the use of an additional tool that will allow frontline staff to sign off when the various transition documents have been reviewed. This tool is called the Resident Care Plan and Personhood Tool Staff Sign-Off Sheet. Within the second pathway, you will also see a reference to in-house transition teams and when and how to use external supports during a transition. Simone will be walking us through the pathways, and then Raquel will be discussing how the formation of in-house transition teams can help to further our transitional support efforts. Before we get to the pathway, let's take a closer look at the tools referenced within. Next slide. The use of a Personhood tool has been highlighted as vital to a smooth transition by all members of our working group. It is unanimous that this tool be considered as important as other standard documents within a transition. A Personhood tool allows care teams across the board throughout each step of a person's transition, no matter how brief of an interaction, a way to best communicate and connect with an individual on their level, promoting a sense of comfort during an often traumatic time in their life. This is especially important during the pandemic, with more staff turnover than ever and a surge of new transitions. The risk of our seniors' personhood getting lost in the process has increased tenfold, and the risk of transfer trauma is amplified as a result. Extensions of the tool can be used to create in-room wall templates, conversation starters, and communication boards that will allow frontline staff to provide diligent, streamlined care. The Personhood tool will assist activation and nursing staff in creating a tighter all-around care plan and assist external transitional support teams, such as BSOT and LOFT, in focusing their efforts. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the Resident Care Plan and Personhood Tool staff sign-off sheet will allow frontline staff to sign off when the various transition documents have been reviewed, and also serves as a reminder to each member around the documents they've yet to get to. This tool can be used by the behavioral support leads to identify where to focus the use of their external supports to assist in building capacity. For example, BSR transitional support, including document review and coaching, LOFT, BSS, PRC and caregiver specialist education, and GMOT and addiction specialist involvement. It can also serve as a conversation starter when frontline staff are concerned with time constraints and used to seek approval from management for extra time to review the documents. I will now hand it over to Simone to introduce our Toronto Central key players and transitional support pathways.
Thanks, and hello, everybody. Thank you, Lindsay. So now that we've met our focus tools, let's see how they fit into the best practice transition pathway we created. The first step in the creation of the pathway was identifying key players. As you can see, we have a wealth of resources in the TC-LIN. In each sector of care, we have many experienced and passionate teams working alongside each other. However, we don't always do a great job of communicating. And this lack of collaboration greatly impacts how often important client information can sometimes get lost along the loop. On the top of everything we're dealing with, the pandemic means that we now face even more significant pressures, with long-term care homes sometimes dealing with up to 25 transitions in one day alone. With these high volumes of rapid and crisis-related movements, there is an increased need to provide support and focus on complex transitions. Using the highlighted provincial tools we've talked about so far, we move now to see how we can create seamless and communicative passage from one team to another, growing towards a more collaborative BSO family. It's time that we see ourselves the way our clients do, not as unrelated teams across different sectors, but as one connected loop of service. So here we see our pathway. Now I know it looks like a lot, but let's go through it and we'll see that a lot of it is what we're doing already. The step one is our transition planning. Although this graphic does start the pathway at the point of discharge, as mentioned earlier, we think it's really important to initiate transition planning well in advance of this stage. The All About Me tool and the My Transition Care Plan during the COVID pandemic can be initiated from the moment the long-term care application is started. There's even been instances already where completing these documents have actually resulted in an increase of acceptance into long-term care waitlists versus rejections. The client care lead or our transition lead, and that could be anyone from a home and community care coordinator or a discharge planner if you're in hospital, could activate and endorse these tools at the time the long-term care application process is started. Step two is implementation and handover. We want to stress here that no one person is expected to fill these tools out themselves or alone, but rather the importance of that primary agent ensuring that the tools are filled by the appropriate party. For example, maybe the family fills out the All About Me tool, while the My Transition Care Plan for the COVID pandemic is completed by a combination of forces, including inpatient BSO teams, a care coordinator, or the hospital staff. Once these tools are completed, it's imperative that someone on the team, again, we suggest the transition lead, arrange a touch base with the receiving team. It's at this time that together they can review the completed tools in order to prep for the admission day. Step three is preparation. The client is then physically transitioned into long-term care, and it's up to the long-term care behavioral support team or intake team to ensure that the tools are reviewed and understood by the long-term care staff so that they can be implemented within the home within the first few days post-admission. This is where that staff sign-off sheet Lindsay talked about can really come in handy to provide a list to the staff of the documents that each client is associated with. The last step is implementation. We remember in this final step that all the work of the previous teams can become nothing more than words on a page if it's not implemented by the receiving team. It might be that new behaviors start an admission or the old strategies from the discharge site aren't entirely appropriate for long-term care. But in these cases, don't be afraid to reach out to your in-house BSO teams, BSOT, GMOT, and the PRCs and others in order to find out how to best use the information gathered in the tools to create a new long-term care specific care plan. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see how the pathway sits on top of the transition loop. At each stage, it's highlighted when you should activate or implement one of the various transition tools and which team is in the best place to do so. The TC-Lin Transition Working Group has created a simplified version of the pathway, so it's even easier to see where your team can step into the loop. We also have the links for all the transition tools we've highlighted today, as well as some other supporting resources that we think can be really useful. And we can make this available to you or your team upon request. You'll also notice that this slide highlights the importance of long-term care homes forming in-house transition teams, something that Raquel is going to speak to more in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So to wrap up our section, we just want to say we recognize that this may seem like a lot to take on, especially in light of all the hard work we're already doing to support our clients and the battle that we continue to wage with COVID. But the main takeaway that we want to highlight is that none of the teams are in this alone. We're in it together. We encourage you to reach out, to invite family members and caregivers to engage in filling out the forms, and to pull on the knowledge and efforts of your colleagues. Because remember, these moves are extremely stressful for our clients, and it's easy to lose information. All of this places our seniors at risk for transfer trauma, which can increase the potential for new responsive behaviors where maybe none existed. It can exacerbate existing behaviors, and it can even trigger medical issues like deliriums or falls. Without unification and communication, all the individual work that we do in our teams can become undone or simply get lost in transition. By using a collaborative approach, we can maximize our results, we can really make a difference for our clients, we can support each other, and we can strengthen the system. Now Raquel is going to share with us how long-term care homes can create in-house transition teams, which position them to be better able to deal with the increased demand of these complex and urgent transitions. Raquel, if you're ready.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm sorry. Hello, everyone. As we all know, admissions to long-term care evokes many emotions and fears for new residents and their family members. New residents are experiencing several losses, including changes to their relationship with their family and their friends. To them, it's a final stop in their life's journey. Along with the losses of independence, they have to get acquainted to new routines and structures. Residents transitioning into long-term care are required to adapt to numerous demands, such as living with strangers and adjusting from traditional to institutional meals, and doing it all in a very short time. The purpose of the long-term transition care team is to recognize the challenges and offer support to all residents who are admitted to the facility. Long-term care in-house transition teams can provide new residents with an organized, systematic support to make their experience less challenging. The in-house transition team support pathway we are all presenting today will benefit also the long-term care staff who are involved with the transition process and care to new residents. So successful integration of the new residents will increase the capacity of long-term care for the residents with complex care needs, and most importantly, reduce frustrations and discontentment. So the primary goal is to create a clear transition process so that the staff know their role, and in the whole process, they can support the new resident. It is important for every home to have an in-house transition team. However, the composition of the team may be different for each home as their available resources may vary. So we're proposing the following members to be a part of the transition team. It will include the charge nurse, the primary PSW, the activation staff on the unit, and of course the BSO in-house lead. The first thing that the behavior lead will do is to review the information received in the application or on the day of admissions. The behavior lead will share the personhood information included in my transitional care plan or any other attached document with all team members who will be involved in the care of the resident. So on the day of admissions, the in-house transition team will welcome the new resident and accompanying family member and familiarize them with the home's address and address any questions or concerns they may have and support them in redesigning their rooms and to make it more home-like. The nursing team will then assume the responsibility to include the new residents' care needs and preferences into the long-term care plan. The activation team and the behavior lead will explore the new residents' activities of interest and determine how this resident would like to engage in the facility. The behavior lead and the activationist will also introduce the resident to co-residents and establish a friendly contact and orient them to the residents and the amenities. Behavior lead will consult with the primary care team and to determine the need for the involvement in external partners and complete any referrals as needed. The in-house transition team will continue to be involved in the residents and family life to adjust to the long-term care environment and the transition stage until the transition stage is resolved. So now we may think that this is a lot of work and it takes too much time. However, you will come to find out that this time is well spent. Can we move over to the next slide, please? So when we have a new resident, who are known to have behavioral expressions, we recognize the need to adopt a proactive intervention plan to manage the behavioral expressions from the time of admissions to avoid any crisis or placement breakdown. So once the new resident has arrived, the behavior lead will complete the referral to the BSR team if they have not been involved already in the planning of the transition. And the behavior lead will also initiate the DOS, CMAI pieces, and other assessment tools as appropriate to make the referral to GMOT PRCs as required. The behavior lead will facilitate a 15-minute weekly huddle during the shift change, which we find will be more reasonable for staff time and management, and change and review the progress notes to improve communications between the team members and update the care plan and intervention strategies. So external team members will attend these huddles if possible to continue to offer the support on the primary care team. And of course, this will all be done virtually. To wrap up the discussion on the in-house transition support team, we would like to emphasize the need to streamline the in-house pathway and process to support the new resident and their family members. The BSO lead will take the responsibility to establish the new in-house transition team for the new residents and actively support the work task assigned to each team member. The transition team will continue to support the new resident and assist them in the primary team of the transition period, again, until it is resolved. And the family will be comfortable into the long-term care environment, and hopefully the transition will be much smoother. So moving on to the third slide, which is a case study. So I would just like to go through this case study to show you how these tools can be implemented in like a daily transition with a long-term care potential resident. So here we have Mr. D, who was admitted to acute care hospital after he was found on the floor by his PSW from the Home and Community Care Services. When the application for the placement were submitted, they were rejected by all 5 long-term care facilities, and he was one of the 8 ALC patients on the surgical unit. He could not move to an ALC facility if he was not on any long-term care wait list. He was frustrated when he heard his application was rejected. The reason for the rejection were based on the history of his addictions, hoarding, and paranoid personality disorder, leading to poor working relationships with the Home and Community Care Service PSWs. So Mr. D had 8 admissions in the past 12 months and with the diagnosis of failure to cope. He continued to return home with the hope of doing better. He was not able to maintain his apartment. During this admission, due to physical deterioration, he was looking forward to a better quality of life in the long-term care. To prevent financial abuse by his drinking buddies, community caseworker had referred him to PGT. Pending this process, he had no access to his funds. He struggled with chronic anxiety and depression. Formal assessments indicated cognitive deficits and low level of intellectual development disabilities. Head trauma due to 2 falls. low energy with CHF and MH challenges. His MOCA score was 17 over 22. He was frail and he was saying, "I want to live." And he was afraid of dying if he returned home. He could not walk short distances with his, he could walk short distances with his walker. He ate his meals with setup required with ADLs, sorry. So the My Transitional Care Plan during COVID-19 was recommended and became critical in his acceptance to long-term care, which made it possible to discharge him to an off-site ALC bed. The following recommendations, ALC and long-term care staff use personhood information from ABM and My Transitional Care Plan COVID-19 in developing person-centered care plan. The My Transitional Care Plan helped the long-term care staff know the triggers for his frustration, preferences to waking up at 10 a.m. He'd like to have clean glasses when eating his meals and showers on Monday mornings. His love for classical music and pet visits also helped the staff manage his behaviors. Staff learned classical music helps him to relax when he is upset, and it provides opportunity for all staff to read and sign off on the residence care plan and personhood tools. So that was a checklist that the staff partaked in. So yes, a copy of the My Transitional Care Plan was left in the conference room along with the All About Me documents and the other tools. So all of these tools helped Mr. D make the transition much smoother into long-term care, and his transition process was definitely more successful. So I just want to wrap up and say that, like, although the transitional care plan, all the tools may be daunting at first, but adding this into the daily routine, into long-term care, can definitely help staff know the residents better, and it helps with the transition process to make them more feel at home and comfortable in the long-term care setting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel, for this example. And certainly we're seeing some very interesting comments already on the chat. So I'm very excited to transition very soon to the discussion. So just to really sum up some key points, I think the main key points is the collaboration. We're all in this together. What we've been seeing since we've been sharing these tools and pathway and the report back that we are getting from our partners in acute care and long-term care, that the pathway and the tools work. The report back is that, like Raquel said, it's a good investment of time, it saves time, and it absolutely prevents crisis. Raquel, your case provided so many good examples to why that is, and a lot of pitfalls that are being avoided just by having the information laid out so clearly. We are also finding, and the feedback that we're getting is that it's applicable beyond just the scope of responsive behaviors. So feel free to make use of it as you see fit, as long as it serves client. You should not just limit yourself to just people with responsive behaviors. There are other complex transitions there that could benefit. And I guess the key message that we want you to take away today is that we can really achieve greater success by working together, like Simone said before, by leveraging our connections across the continuum of care. BSO services certainly thread through all the continuum of care, but we are all in this together. We're all partners, and we can help catch the rope on both ends by being ambassador in our organizations to using this pathway and tools. We've been seeing that in some long-term care homes in some regions, they've actually made these tools mandatory for admission. So we're getting a lot of good enthusiasm and a lot of good results, and we really encourage people to make use of that. So I'll just end by saying you have here, and we will share those slides, you have here links to the tools, but also to some additional tools that for specific cases when there is a certain issue involved, you may want to also lean on other tools, and certainly the isolation toolkit that is quite relevant for transitions now during the COVID pandemic, developed by TRI, is another tool that we often use hand in hand, as Jillian and Caitlin mentioned. I want to finalize by really acknowledging the people behind this work. You can see that many partners in the across Toronto Central LIN from various sectors have participated in this work, but I did really want to give also a big shout out to Lindsay Glover, that really was the lead of the working group at the Toronto Central LIN in pulling this work together. And of course to everyone else involved. And we also want to acknowledge the work, the great work that was done and triggered all of this provincially. And you can see here the groups and participants from the provincial level that contributed to the development of this wonderful tool and checklist. So with that, we'll move on to the discussion. I will hand off back to Stacy in a minute, but we typically in the discussion section, we leave you time to ask questions, but today we also wanted to combine with questions that we have for you. And one of them is, in which transitions do you see this pathway and tools useful? And how can we best position this tool to become a standard part of the transition process? And lastly, what is the best route to increase knowledge and uptake of the tool in an acute care setting? And I would add to that from the comment that I see from Rebecca, also how do we make sure that the information from acute care trickles all the way down to the frontline staff at the long-term care facility? Thank you for that sharing, Rebecca. And I think maybe we can hear more from you in this discussion since you've already had so much experience with the resources and the tools.
Thanks, Einat. So we are entering the discussion period of rounds right now. I just wanted to say thank you so much to the speakers for that useful and comprehensive approach to transitions. So we do have some comments going on in the chat. I know some of the presenters have responded to some people. I wanted to invite Kay. If you were able to unmute or come on camera and maybe ask your question or talk more about your question.
Hi, sure. Hello, everybody. I'm more involved in the clinical end, and certainly the BSOT team has been a godsend in our program, the TIP program. One thing that often I find is that there are behavior changes. Sometimes they're subtle, but often they're related to clinical changes. And sometimes it's a little confusing who to approach, who to communicate to when these happen in order to get a quick intervention. So that's the sort of thing I'm interested in linking into this transition, because the transition, the previous residents might be quite familiar with these behaviors, but in the new accommodation, they may not be aware of what to watch for. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I would also like to, Rebecca, if you can, you did write in the chat a nice example and highlighted some relevant points. And I think Lindsay had discussed a bit of using this sign-off sheet, but if you're comfortable to do so, Rebecca, if you'd like to state the point that you made so that everyone else can hear as well.
I'm seeing in the chat pod, Simone, that Rebecca doesn't have audio on her computer.
I see that. Rebecca, is it okay? I'm gonna read it out. I hope that's okay. But I just thought it was a very good point. So Rebecca just said to everybody, from an acute care perspective, I complete and send all the transition information, including behavioral care plan, and many times it either does not make it to the frontline staff, as in it sits on a desk, or is put into a chart without being reviewed, or it is received, but it's not reviewed. Information is sometimes not reviewed by all staff so that they are aware of the care plan. I know it is likely that site-specific with some homes, but something to keep in mind with new admissions. Maybe a huddle, a bulletin board in the nursing station with info on your new resident, or some sort of visual indicator that there is a behavior plan in place. So I definitely want to bring that up. I don't know if anyone on our team wants to speak to that directly. I bet somebody does.
Hi, everyone. I can definitely speak to that. So as working as an in-house behavior lead, I do recognize that staff are really busy and it's very hard to host staff meetings on the floor if it's not something that's very urgent. But I find that, as I discussed in the presentation, that going over these behaviors and the behavior care plan that has been brought to the long-term care by the acute care teams is something that can be reviewed during shift change. So that's the time where all staff are at the nursing station and are all ears. And if the behavior lead can pick out key points from, because they don't have time to read out that whole care plan, but ensuring that the key points are made clear, and doing that for about a week, because we know that there's full-time, part-time staff and all of that. So being consistent and ensuring that all staff members are up to date on the new admission. So I find that very helpful to be putting that out there at shift change. And of course, the behavior lead is not there 24 hours for morning, evening, and night staff. So having the care team, which is the charge nurse and PSW, whoever's on the care team, to relate that information to the other staff and having that checklist signed off on. Yeah.
The staff sign-off sheet is excellent for this purpose too, just to add to Raquel, like to utilize to across shifts with the day, the evening, the night shift, just to have them, give them a chance to review the documents. It's, even if they can't get to all of them, they can get to the most relevant ones depending on the case.
Yeah, and if I can build on that provincially from what we've heard in certain pockets of the province as well, we've heard from teams that have had really great success in obtaining consent from the person and or their SDM to post the personhood tool, or perhaps, you know, 5 items from the larger personhood tool on inside the person's room, either inside the door of a closet or somewhere on a nightstand, really having that information accessible. Many laminating it and posting it on the wall. We've heard from teams in primarily, I'll say in long-term care, that have had a lot of success in being able to obtain the consent to post the information so that it is accessible to anybody who is providing care or interacting with that person in their room.
And just to build on that further, there's also been some recommendations among the collaborative members that we host provincially on using different color paper to really highlight some of those and get the attention. There was even talk of using lanyards or magnets with the BSO emblem that they could put on whiteboards for that particular resident, just as a quick indicator that there is a care plan, a behavioral care plan in place that can be referenced when time allows. So there's a couple different routes that can be made to have access to that information in a very quick and easy process. I say that with air quotes, recognizing everyone's time constraints, but just to sort of get in the habit of creating that space to review those really important information.
So I just wanted to say that we have Shamila Ahmed who has her hands up, so I wanted to give her an opportunity to respond, and I'll just say that there is also some suggestions to see what role long-term care plus and also social workers can play in the pathway. So we will capture those and absolutely I think that those should be integrated into the pathway. Ashmila, would you like to speak up, to unmute yourself and ask your question or comment?
So I think it's a wonderful tool. It's the first time I've seen it. There's a lot of duplication, which isn't a bad thing, but it means, and I come from the background of a coordinator in the community with Home and Community Support Services, Toronto Central. So I'd be doing the long-term care applications and looking at getting people accepted. Your example is my client and many of our clients. So when we're doing the behavioral section in our long-term care application, there's a lot of back and forth with what you have and what we have to put in. I'm wondering if it'd be okay, or is it acceptable that we'd be saying refer to the care plan, or do we, we also have it in the RISE. So one of the barriers could be that it's another process, it's another form. But that said, it's not just for us to do, it's for others to do, which is where the work, it's where we need to sort of set ways of how people can get to that. Otherwise it becomes another mountain. And I don't want to be negative, because I have worked with, different teams and memory care units, and this is what we've been trying to get. And we're no longer, as home care, former Lynn, we're no longer in hospital as the hospital coordinators, where that would have been what I think we would have done. So there's a lot of changes. There's a lot of different processes going on, different titles, different roles. We're not working with social workers. We're working with transitional navigators who do or don't do or may not have the experience the expertise to sort of work with this. Maybe that's an area that needs to be worked, maybe they're your target group as well. And we're going to be going into the hospitals, and with COVID and other things, yes, it's a great idea, but how do we convince the acute care, if we're going in, to do a format when we can't even get a decent referral half the time? And I hope I don't get in trouble for that, but so be it. But you know what I mean? Like there's hard enough times trying to get things on paper for us, let alone start this. I mean, I think it'd be helpful to say, when we're recognizing there's problems, and we all know what acute care is like, it's the worst thing for a person who's going through delirium and hasn't even been worked up yet, and is already considered a difficult challenge, well, not even challenging, a difficult client. So there's so many caveats to this, and we're all working in different sort of silos. I mean, it is transitional, everything's been changed, but we're still trying to figure it. I would like to see more when there's behaviors that the acute care team is triggered to do a DOS right away. And it doesn't become, oh, this is the new baseline. Oh, this is not delirium, or delirium superimposed on dementia, when the person never had this before. So those are my little kind of comments and recommendations. And I'll turn the phone off.
Thanks so much, Ishmila. It's great to have that care coordination perspective, as you see so much of kind of the continuum of care, or the kind of the aspects of the system. Certainly, we know that it's not ideal, that we know that there is a lot of barriers and difficulties. And I think one of the key messages that kind of in response to the barriers that you very well pointed out is that it's not only on a single person or care coordinator to do this. It's all of us guarding together to try and get the information. And yes, sometimes there is a duplication of information, and that's why sometimes attaching the RAI rather than filling it up again might be a better strategy, like Jillian and Caitlin mentioned at the beginning. But at least we have some pathway and a guide to what information we want to make sure is shared in those transitions. And it's really about all of us reinforcing kind of on all sides. I also wanted to respond to Shauna's comment. Shauna, you asked about the 14 days isolation, the challenge on getting timely or any external supports into the long-term care home during COVID, but also how the quarantine period exacerbates responsive behaviors. We certainly addressed that in the isolation path, in the transition pathway. We call it a double transition kind of planning, because you have to plan often for transitioning to the isolation location and then transitioning from that, be it within the same unit or from unit to unit into the more permanent location afterwards. That's certainly a barrier that the whole system is currently managing. And we definitely highlighted the isolation toolkit as a great tool to plan for that period as part of the transition planning. And it certainly needs to be embedded in our planning right now, because we know that people will be isolated. And it certainly is challenging. The other thing that I would say is that external resources are available, but I think it's slightly different the way that they're available in person or virtual. So I'm not sure in which region you're working in, but we did find that either way you could lean on those resources to help at least guide, whether virtually or in person, but to guide the planning. Recognizing this is a difficult time. Lindsay, I see you have your hands up, so maybe I'll give you kind of the final words before we have to part, because we're at time.
I did want to say that a lot of the concerns that are being brought up are things that we've addressed over and over again within our working group, and that we're trying to work towards. And one thing that we identified is that when you think in terms of silos, we'd like to think of more of like it's just one big continuation of care, continual loop of care. So the My Transitional Care Plan, even if it cannot be completely filled out, it's good to be able to like staple things onto it the way that that Jillian had pointed out. Fill out what you can, but just make sure that you're moving it forward, so that like eventually the goal, once the individual ends up in long-term care, which is what we're hoping for, that all of that information on that care plan can then be disseminated throughout the LTC home and all the way up to the in-room environment with templates as an extension of the care plan. It's sort of, it all needs to work together. And just to quickly address, I see Rosemary has written here, connecting with transitional navigators in acute care would be great. That's something that we've been working towards as well, is to get more people on board and just to sort of expand this idea and so that's something that is in the works.
Great, thank you. So we are out of time. Certainly a lot of comments and questions on the content. I just wanted to take some time and say thank you to everyone for joining us today. And I'm sure the speakers wouldn't mind if you followed up with them about some of your comments and your questions. And thank you to the presenters for the comprehensive and useful approach to transitions that you shared with us today. Just a quick reminder to those that are still on the call that if you would like a certificate of attendance, just complete the brief evaluation survey, and a recording will be available on the Ontario CLRI website as well as the BSO websites. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.